So the next part we're going to get into is what's called a multivariate model, right? So multivariate models are where you're going to take a bunch of different variables and you're going to use them to predict some outcome. The easiest way of thinking of this is about a card game. Play a game of cards. When you get your first two cards dealt to you, there's a certain probability that you're going to win, right? But that probability begins to become more defined and understood and reliable as more cards are dealt on the table. And then there's an obvious winner and an obvious loser. So a multivariate model is that idea of playing that full game out, having all the cards on the table and then predicting what the likelihood of the outcome is, or just most of the cards on the table, I should say. I shouldn't say all the cards, because if you have all the cards, then you already know what the outcome is. But most of the cards are on the table, and you've got a pretty good idea of what the odds are. And that's how you know you have a good model. And a good model predicts that. That's what you hold on to. So for the probability of an outcome, if related to other factors, that's what we're gonna create here. That's a formula. So the odds of death from COVID can be related to age, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, COPD, and obesity. And some people are going to have some of those features and some won't. So we're going to give you an example here. So patient number one, an 80-year-old male with diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. And what we're going to say is the formula predicts that 85 times out of 100, that patient's going to die. But 15 times out of 100, they're going to live, right? Patient number two is a 40-year-old female with COPD. And the odds are 5 out of 100, she's going to die, and 95 out of 100, she's going to live. And for patient number three, we're going to have a 40-year-old male with diabetes, and the odds are 10 out of 100 that he's going to die, and 90 out of 100 that he lives. So when you sum all of these odds of death and expected deaths, you end up with one, right? You expect one of these three to die, because 85 plus 5 plus 10 gives you 100 out of 100, right? So one of them is going to die, and then two out of this group are expected to live, right? So that's calculated here as 95 plus 15 plus 90. That gives you 200, so that's 2. So if this model is a good model, then it should match up that one person dies and 2 people survive. And then we apply that to a whole bunch of patients. So we're gonna have 10 patients. Each one of these patients has a different probability of death, and we kind of color that here to the right side as darker shades of red indicate higher likelihood of dying. And if we add all that up, we get expected deaths of 4.5 here. So we expect 4.5 deaths out of this group of 10 based on this modeling. And a good model is total expected deaths equals the total observed deaths, right? So half a person can't die, but over the course of many other patients, we expect certainly at least 4 deaths to be present in this group of 10. Now, if we multiply that, each one of these by 1,000, right, then what we really have is an expected rate of 4,500 deaths. So out of 10,000 patients, we're expecting 4,500 of them to die based on this modeling. Now, this is a made-up model, right? So this is not a COVID model, but this is how modeling occurs. So we're like, okay, so if 4,500 are expected to die, and we actually observe 4,500 that died, then we're like, wow, that's a really good model. But you can see here that patients with the 0.2 have 200 deaths, right? So we weren't expecting a lot of deaths in this group, but 20% of them are expected to die. So that's not a group where you walk away from. You're just like, okay, well, we don't have to worry about that because no one's going to die in the 0.2 group. It's like, no, it represents that there's a portion of people that the model doesn't fully explain. So 20% of them are still dying. And what happens is this very complex feature here. The majority of people that are in a model are usually at one side of the model or the other, and they're usually at the lower end of probabilities. So the distribution, instead of being 1,000 in each category of risk, is we have a differential distribution. And so we have 1,000 patients that have a 0.2 chance of dying, and only 20 patients that have a 0.8 chance, have an 80% chance of dying, right? And this difference in the distribution creates this type of modeling where you end up with we're predicting 1,332 deaths. But when you look at that more closely, 1,200 of those deaths are occurring in individuals whose probability is less than 40%. And this is why models can appear to be so confusing to people, and why they can be so confusing to the public, that the majority of the people who are actually dying were individually modeled to survive. And it's important to understand that in a population model like this, in a multivariate model, individual risk appears to be disconnected from the cumulative risk. And these features of these modeling techniques are important in that they can be very good models, and they can predict the expected number of deaths and then the observed number of deaths. But they can still be difficult on an individual basis to reapply to a person. This is why modeling is a population level statistic analysis, which is a very fine level of analysis and really teasing out what are the determinants of a disease. But in and of themselves, of being able to go back and inform a patient, oh, listen, you're in the 20% category, don't worry, you're going to be fine. It doesn't work that way. And so it's important to understand those differences, because they influence how we inform patients and what our vigilance is clinically with their treatment. And I think that part's the more important aspect of this, is understanding that if somebody has a clinical disease and it's present and it's severe enough to require them to be hospitalized, irrespective of what their predicted level of death risk is, that you as the practitioner are treating a patient that needs to maintain your vigilance to and attention to the small details of their care. All right, so like any game, risks change over time. So most multivariate models don't account for that type of analysis. Most multivariate models just look at things in a static way over just the entire period of the study. And so I'm going to give you an example of what they don't do, what they can do if you get more sophisticated with this. But the patients admitted with COVID-19, they're hypoxic, they have COPD and diabetes, and their risk of death is 15%. On day 3, they start having kidney dysfunction. Now their risk is 30%. On day 7, they have liver dysfunction, and the risk is now 45%. On day 9, they're intubated, and the risk increases to 60% chance of mortality. And this is much like a poker game, where on day 1, you're dealt your whole cards. On day 3, you have the flop. On day 7's the turn, and day 9's the river. And this is when you begin to appreciate that a multivariate model begins to change over time, and that attention to detail and that patient's clinical progression is a more important feature than any of these other things, but they're very hard to mathematically put into a way that we describe to the public. And so while we understand this and we can appreciate how it affects us in terms of decision making, this is not something that we easily just summarize for each other and put on the evening news. So when a disease occurs early on, like we're experiencing now, we have a certain level of prevalence that occurs, and then mitigation strategies are used to flatten the curve, so to speak here, right? But then once you've gotten to that point, you're not done. Now there's still 2 possible trajectories. And just like in a card game, when you get the whole card positions, you still have a bunch of cards waiting for you. And so the possible trajectory of changes that can occur is really broad and really wide. And so we will begin to understand more on a second wave of this as to what that trajectory is going to be more like. And unfortunately, one of the things that occurs is that it's easiest to control and have the best effective mitigation strategy early on with low prevalence. Once the disease prevalence increases to a certain threshold, it gets much harder for a mitigation strategy to work, primarily because it's harder to get the population to comply with those strategies. And we're seeing all the fatigue and everything else that's occurring where people are just sick and tired of being stuck in their homes and the social distancing and so on and so forth. So the likelihood that you're going to tighten that hole and tighten that grip in terms of mitigation strategy becomes less and less over time. And so you're much more likely in second waves to see higher peaks than you are in first waves. And so that's just something that should be expected.